Hi, my name is Jenna Nielsen, and I decided to do a video presentation because I feel like I'm better with speeches and my words. And I also kind of thought, because it's COVID-19, you probably want to see some faces and hear some voices. So I hope you enjoy. The documentary that I chose to do is called The Mask You Live In. I had never heard of this documentary, but I'm so glad that this is one of the options you gave us, because it is amazing. I sobbed, like bawled like a baby. It talks about really important things that need to be discussed and need to be changed. The main topic for this documentary is that masculinity is socially constructed and the negative effects that it has on the male brain, and eventually the negative effects it has on society because of that. It starts off with this old man, and he's talking about his younger self, and he goes back to a memory of him being downstairs at his grandpa's house, and his grandpa comes down because he's crying, and he tells him, "Don't cry, be a man." And I think that is a great way to start this documentary off, because that is 100% where it starts. So then it moves on to just a bunch of different age groups of men or boys. And so it starts out from really, really young to about middle-aged. And they are just asking these kids and these teenagers and these adults, why don't you share your emotions, or how do you feel about this? And these little kids, like 9 or 8, are saying, if you didn't know me, you wouldn't know that I was in pain. And I kind of took a step back at that, and I was like, wow, these little boys already understand the pressure that society is putting on them. And they started to say things like, we don't cry, or we were taught to fight back, or to never back down. And these things are drilled into these minds of young, innocent boys, and they feel the need to be manly and tough and to not cry, which eventually causes a lot of mental illness and a lot of self-hatred towards themselves. So then it moves on to this guy, and his name's Tony Porter, and he's an educator, and he says that there are 3 rules that we teach boys. The first rule being that masculinity equals athleticism. So if you're not athletic, you're not a man. And I 100% believe that is true, that these little kids from a young age are taught to play football, basketball, baseball, to have a toned body, to be tougher than the girls, to be stronger than the girls. And it's kind of forced on them. And if they're not, they don't fit in. They don't fit into the manly group, and they kind of just feel disconnected. The second rule is masculinity equals economic success. And I think that comes in the future, that as they get to high school or college, they start to understand that they have this pressure on them of making money, being powerful, and getting respect. And without that, you're nothing. You're not a man. And that is a really tough thing to talk about, because I think that is a really big issue, and it is something that all men suffer, like they feel this pressure of making money and being able to buy their own house or have everything that they want. And if they don't, again, they're not a man. The third rule is masculinity equals sexual dominance. And with that, I think it's leaning more towards, getting the girl that everybody wants, or getting the hottest girl, or, even just being like, no, I'm the man, I get to do this towards women. And I think all of those rules fall into a hypermasculinity trait. And hypermasculinity is very toxic. I think that is one of the biggest issues in our society today, is the pressure that we put on men to be a man and to be masculine and to not show their feminine side. So then this documentary, it just continues on with multiple life accounts of every age, every race of men, and they talk about how sad they actually are, and how they can't share their feelings because they want to fit in with their group, or they want to be seen as a man because society won't accept it any other way. So a lot of scientists were in this documentary, and a lot of them talked about how eventually they lose emotions and they lose intimacy. And that part blew my mind, because I think that, like my personal experience, I know that I've had multiple talks with boyfriends and being like, tell me how you feel, show me your emotions, like I want to listen, and they just don't. And it's because they've been drilled since they were born, basically, to not do that. And so eventually it's going to disappear. If you don't do it, you're never going to do it. And I think that the pressure of society is a really big thing, in that they do, like men kind of have it bad, and they're not supposed to show feelings. And so one term that they talked about a lot was no homo. And all these scientists had the same thing basically to say about it, is that when kids or teenagers say no homo, they mean it in a sense of, I complimented you, but I'm going to say no homo afterwards, so you don't think that I'm like attracted to you, or you don't think that I'm girly, or, that I noticed that. I liked your shoes, no homo. And I think that was a crazy thing. And one scientist said it's a way of them to express their feelings without the fear of being judged afterwards. And I think that's 100% true for all cases when they say no homo. So that was pretty cool. So then the documentary started to just give statistics and the negative effects of what that does to a male brain. By age 12, 34% of boys start drinking alcohol. And by age 13, they start doing drugs. And that is a very sad statistic, that such young kids are partaking in those activities just because they feel this pressure to hide everything, and that's their only outlet, because once you do drugs, it's okay for you to hug your friends and to tell them that you love them because you're just high. And I've never thought of it that way, that maybe they do turn to that in order to be able to let some feelings out and not be judged by it, or not be policed by it. So with the drug and alcohol came the talk of depression, and they brought up a really interesting fact about how depression is looked in a feminine way, meaning that when you think of depression, you think of being quiet and sleeping all day, not eating, which are things that women tend to do when they're depressed. Men, on the other hand, start to curse and start to drink and start to fight and break laws, and they express it that way. Fewer than 50% of boys admit to having mental illness, and that's super sad. Mental illness is something that needs to be treated, and it needs the proper treatment. But if you're not willing to admit it, you're just going to always be struggling with that. And that is one pressure that we've put on them, is, you're not going to be a man if you admit to that. Every day, 3 or more teen boys commit suicide. 3 or more a day. And that to me is just crazy. And I think that number would lower drastically if we could teach boys that it's okay to have emotions, it's okay to cry, it's okay to grieve. Like, we're here to listen. The highest rate for suicide of boys is the age 20 to 24. And I think that's because they get to that age where they feel the pressure of being successful. That's the age where you have to decide what you're going to do for the rest of your life. You should be married, you should have kids, you should have your own home, you should have your own car. And I think because it's so hard to reach that nowadays, that it kind of ruins their self-confidence, and they think, I'll never get that. I'll never be there. And so that makes a lot of sense to me, for that one to be the highest rate of suicide. So then the documentary started talking about Hollywood movies, and this is the part that I thought was the coolest part of the whole thing, because as a woman, I watch the movies and I'm like, oh, he's hot. Boys watch movies and they think, like, I need to be like him, and I've never thought that before, because it's just a movie. But every single movie you watch is a dominant man, and that has guns, money, women, and that they can fight, they save the day. All movies are like that. And I started to think, what is that doing for the male image? What is that doing to their self-confidence as they watch these movies? Even if they don't think that it's happening way deep back there. So then it started to talk about video games and violence. So as I said before, it negatively affects the brain, and then it affects society. And so video games was one that was really interesting, because I know that there's like controversial ideas about video games, but it started to bring it up, and it said, this is the only way that they can show emotions. As they sit and they play these video games and they mass murder people, they're letting out that rage and that anger. And one thing that I thought was super cool that was brought up was by this scientist, and he said, picture it this way. This teenager comes home and he puts in his headphones and he listens to rap music about killing people or drugs or money or women. And as he's listening to this music, he's playing this video game where he's killing innocent people, or he's killing bystanders, or he's in the military and he's doing crazy things. And you kind of sit and think, like, that is pretty violent. So then it dropped some crazy statistics. The average 18-year-old has seen 200,000 acts of violence, including 400,000 murders. That's all due to video games, social media, and movies. That's a lot of violence, and that is definitely affecting their brain. That is definitely doing something to when they're in a situation similar, it's the first thing they're gonna think of. They're also told that you don't let anyone disrespect you. And so I think the moment that someone does disrespect them, they turn to anger, they turn to rage, they turn to, I have to show my dominance so you don't ever disrespect me again. And in that case, that turns to violence and sometimes even murder. The youngest mass shooter was 11. The youngest mass shooter was 11. That was the part that really hit me, because that is so young. I have a cousin who's 11, and to think about him going out and shooting people is insane. And you think about these kids who are just so built up in this, like, not being able to share their feelings and having to be manly so they fit in. And some boys choose to not. There are theater kids, there are poetry readers, there are painters that are men, and they don't fall into that masculine group, and they become outsiders. And what happens to outsiders? They get bullied, they have terrible mental illness, and they don't know how to deal with it. And to think that it happens at such a young age is insane. So then it starts to talk about porn. 93% of boys are exposed to internet porn. If they look it up or if they don't, it flashes up on their screen. They type in something in Google and it pops up. And I didn't quite understand where this was going until it started to talk about it more and more. 18% of boys have seen rape online. Exposure to pornography increases sexual aggression by 22%. So that goes back to being in high school and having that sexual dominance. Boys, especially now in this hookup culture, they go and they sleep with as many girls as they can in order to go back to their boys and be like, hey, guess what I did? And it gains them respect from them, from their boys. And porn has a lot to do with that. Like, it started to talk about how it just totally desensitizes them, and they start to look at women as objects instead of human beings and something that they can just take. And that goes along with violence as well. Some of the terms that boys use are like, I'd love to hit that, I'd love to tap that, I'd love to tear that apart. And if you pay attention to the words they're using, hit, violence, it, object, that, object, tear, violence. And I don't think that they mean to do that, but it is so ingrained in their brain that it's just there. They don't see humanity in girls And I think that that is higher than it's ever been, especially because of this hookup culture that we're in. One scientist called it the great setup. She said they're taught to reject feminine things. They're taught to reject femininity. And then we're shocked when they disrespect women. So they're told, don't cry, don't be a man, don't do this, don't do that. And so they grow up and that's what they do. And because of porn, because of video games, because of the things that we tell them as little children, that's all they know. And so it is like the great setup. And that definitely needs to change. So the ending of this documentary ended on a good note in a way. And it said that, you know, we need to fix this. We need to do something about this. And it started to say, you know, we need to teach boys empathy. We need to give boys permission to cry, to process grief, to show their emotions. And we can do that through good media, good technology. They call that the Representation Project. And it was super cool. And to see at the end of this documentary, these boys that were sitting in a circle and they all were sharing their feelings. And at one point, this kid, this teenage boy, shared his emotions and he broke down and cried. And this is where I sobbed, because then this other boy sitting next to him hugged him, grabbed him and hugged him. And I've never seen anything like that. You don't see that. You may see a tap on the shoulder or a, hey, it's gonna be all right, but you don't see a hug. You don't see that kind of empathy. And to see how these lives were changing just solely from the fact of being able to communicate their emotion shows that society has a lot of work to do. That we need to stop this whole, you know, if you're male, you need to do this, and if you're female, you need to do this. So for the next part of this presentation, I was told to pick two main characters from this documentary and talk about them. So I chose to do Ian and Lewis. Ian is a white male. He was probably around 20 to 30, and he lived with his grandpa, no parents. So he lived in a single parent home. He was middle class, and, you know, just some other facts about him. He seemed happy. He seemed like he was okay, but again, that was after he had figured all of this out. And his story is pretty sad. So Lewis he's a Mexican and he's male. He lived with his mother. His father got deported when he was little, back to Mexico after he was caught drunk driving. It didn't say much about his school or what social class they were in, but I did know that he lived in an area with gang members. And that as a social factor is a really big deal. That impacts lives a lot. So Ian's story is he was a cute little blonde-haired boy growing up. He had a high-pitched voice. So as he got to middle school, his hair was super long. His voice was still high-pitched, and he was in theater. He loved theater. And he started to get bullied because of those traits that he had. Two of them were out of his control. And because of gender expectations, he got bullied. And he decided once he got to high school that he wasn't going to do that anymore. And so he gave in to these gender expectations. And he cut his hair. He quit theater, he played more sports, and he started dating the cheer captain. So he fell into that masculine group, and the bullying stopped. He started hanging out with the popular guys, the masculine guys, the cool guys. And his friend, his best friend, from forever, still stayed in that goofy group. And so he had a choice. He had a choice to stick up for his friend or to join the masculine group. And sadly, he chose the masculine group, and he started to bully his best friend. And as he was talking about it, he said that is the thing that he regrets the most. And from my perspective, you look and see what society has done to us, that happens, and it is so sad just for people to fit in. So Lewis, he joined a gang at a very young age. He was hazed, and he started doing drugs and drinking a lot. He became a person he didn't want to become. And he did all of this to fit in, because where he was from, you joined gangs. You didn't go to school. And so as he was talking about it, all he said was that he missed his dad, and he didn't know how to handle those emotions, and he wanted to fit in. He wanted to be socially accepted, so he did the things he did. And he got to a point where he realized he was living a life that he didn't want to, and he became super, super depressed. Didn't tell anyone about it, because that's not what men do. So he became depressed, and he tried to kill himself. And that to me is just like the biggest sign that something does need to get done. The next part is for me to describe myself. I am a white female. I'm 20 years old, and I'm a Christian. I have a fantastic dad and a beautiful mom and 2 older brothers. I lived a really good life. We were middle class in Arizona. The next part is to talk about my struggles in relation to the documentary I watched. I can't because I'm not a male, and I have nothing similar really in that documentary at all. So I'm going to talk about my privileges and my opportunities that I had. I grew up in a Christian household. I never had to worry about food or clothes or where I was going to sleep. And I had a really good education. I went to a private high school, and not only did I go to this private high school, you start at kindergarten and you go with the same kids until you graduate high school. So we all grew very close as a family. Obviously there were our cliques and our, like the mean girls and the jocks. But when it came down to if one of us was hurting, we all stepped in and we all became a family. And with the small classrooms, you were able to have that one-on-one contact with your teachers, and to, the teachers could learn your name and they could actually sit down and be like, hey, I see you're struggling with this, let me help you. And to look back at it now, I didn't think it in the time, I just thought it was another high school, but looking back at it now, that is a huge privilege, and I am so glad to have had that in my life. And, the opportunity that I have to go to college and to start my life, a lot of people don't have that, and I think that is something to be very, very thankful for. I had a really good life growing up. I never had to worry about, oh, my shoes are dirty, I just always got new ones. I always was in fashion, I guess, like you always just had the new things, and I was able to participate in sports and to pay for the uniforms and to pay for the field trips and things like that, and a lot of people don't have that either. So I think that's probably my biggest privilege right there is my high school experience. The next part of this presentation is to talk about how I can relate to the 2 characters that I picked. My life kind of relates to Ian and Lewis, only in a few specific ways. Ian turned into somebody that he didn't want to in order to fit in. I definitely did that. I hid my religion in high school. I started hanging out with the mean girls. And, I definitely became someone that I didn't want to be in order to fit in and to be cool and to be popular. I bought things that I didn't really like just because they were popular. So in no way really does it relate to him, but it does in a lot of ways, as to I changed who I was in order to fit in what society created as normal. With Lewis, he did drugs and drank to feel something, which I did. I graduated high school and I was like, dude, I never did anything fun. I never experienced anything. And my junior year of high school, I was drugged and raped by a guy, and 2 other guys were watching and videoing. And for the longest time, I just hid that, and I didn't want to tell anyone because of what society claims girls like me to be. We're fake. It didn't really happen. You were just drunk, And I was afraid of those stereotypes. I was afraid to get labeled as that, so I didn't tell anyone. And I was just very much hidden in my emotions. And so I turned to drugs and alcohol, and just to feel something. And I totally understand where he was coming from with that was one way to show your emotions without being afraid to do so. Other than that, I don't think that I really fit in at all with their issues, other than society creating something and everybody else following along in order to fit in. The next part is to talk about what I would have done in their situation. And honestly, when I take a step back and think about who I am and my tendencies and my flaws, I don't think I would have handled it near as good as they handled it. Ian became a man who went to college and learned to respect women and to respect his emotions and to know that it was okay for him not to fit in. And that's truly amazing. And Lewis joined this group and was able to talk about his feelings and totally became someone else. Like, he became who he was meant to be. And I think that if I was in their situation, I would struggle a lot. I wouldn't know what to do. I think that I would just continue to fit in and just push all of my emotions behind, because that's what I do. I try to fit in. I try to be the person that everybody likes. And not so much now as I'm growing into who I'm supposed to be, but everybody has their flaws, and that's definitely mine. I want everybody to like me. And so I don't think I would have looked for help. I don't think that I, would take a step back and realize what I was doing was wrong. I think I would just continue to do it. And so I give major props to them they were able to flip their lives around, considering their circumstances and considering how society is. And that's amazing. And I'm so proud of them, and I don't even know who they are. So I don't think that I would do well at all. So that is The Mask You Live In, and it's a great documentary. Thank you so much for sharing it with me. This class has been a blast, and I've learned so much from you and from the textbook and everything that it will definitely change the way that I view the world and how I view gender. So thank you so much.